Hey guys, welcome to another video. My name is Paul, Lamine, IT Disciple, whatever you want to use is fine with me. And this is where we learn, break things, fail, and then fix it. So if you're new here, make sure you hit the thumbs up button if you like the video. Subscribe if you want to see some more videos like this. So a couple of weeks ago, I uploaded a video that kind of go through the process, or I kind of highlight the process that I had to go through to set up my PAULKOROMA server, my Type 1 hypervisor. I did touch a little bit about what an iDRAC is and what it does, but I didn't go into too much detail about it. So this video is going to be a detailed look at what an iDRAC is, the hardware on the server itself. We're going to look at that, how to set it up, and we're going to look at the GUI interface itself and then kind of walk around there and try to understand what it does and what we can do with it. So if you're new here and you like this video, make sure you hit that thumbs up button. If you want to see some more videos like this all the time, hit the subscribe button and then turn on your notification. If you do want to see that video that I talked about, where I go through the whole process of setting up my PAULKOROMA server, I'll link it somewhere up top so you can click on that. And also, if you want to jump to a specific part on the video, there's a menu in the description. You can just go there, look at what you're looking for, and just jump through the whole thing. With that being said, let's get into the video. Okay guys, so before we get started talking about iDRAC, before we start looking at the hardware itself and start playing around with it, let's first talk about what an iDRAC is. So an iDRAC is the integrated Dell remote access controller. It's a piece of hardware that sits on the server's motherboard that allows you to update, manage Dell system, even when the server is turned off. It also provides both the web interface and the command line, but we're mostly going to pay attention to the web interface in this video, as we're not going to do the command lines. Maybe some other time I will do something that has to do with the command line. Other server vendors also have something similar to the Dell iDRAC. I think HP called theirs the ILO. So if you're using an HP server, it might be called ILO. That's something to look up. But now that you have a better understanding of what, or now that we have a better understanding of what the iDRAC is, let's go look at it. Let's see where it's located on the server, and let's kind of play around with it a little bit. Just look at it so we have some sort of familiarity with where it's located on the server before we get started setting it up. Let's go. Okay guys, so this is the server right here. I'm just going to go back a little bit so you guys can take a closer look at it. So maybe in some other video I will kind of break down everything that's in the server and all that stuff, but not in this video. Maybe we'll talk about something like that in another video. So what I want you guys to pay attention to is this section right here, especially this part right here. So I'm going to move kind of a little bit to the back right here, and we're going to talk about this guy right here. Now you notice that there's kind of like four there's 4 ports here, Ethernet ports here. That's used for the internet coming directly into the server, and of course I like color coordinated my color. So that's used for different Ethernet port coming into the server, and you can do teaming if you want to here. But let's not pay attention to this guy right here. Let's pay attention to this guy right here. So this is the iDRAC port right here. This is the iDRAC Ethernet ports right here. So if you look a little bit closer, you can see it says iDRAC on it. So this is where you will connect your Ethernet cable, and you connect it to your ISP or whatever you have given Ethernet to your iDRAC. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that a lot of people, or when people set up iDRAC, they set it up, they have one separate setup for, or ISP coming into their iDRAC server, and then they have another separate line, another separate ISP or separate line coming into the Ethernet port themselves. Now, the reason for that is that if this is offline, you're still able to get into the server and kind of make adjustments or turn things off or do whatever you need to do. That's ideal because you keep them separated. That's an ideal way of doing it, because when it's separated, you can say, hey, even if this is down, I can still go into my server. I can still see what's going on. And of course, if this is down on this part, then you might not be able to get into it. But at this point in time, you'll be able to get into the server and might be able to play around with things and make things right. So that's the way some people do it. They just kind of have different separate component in terms of ISP for each section. So one ISP coming in here and one ISP coming in here. But that's what I wanted you guys to see right here. First, let's take a look at the ports, which is the iDRAC ports here. This is where you connect it. And again, I wanted you guys to know that, or realize that it's separated from your regular Ethernet ports, or your regular ports here, your NIC your server NIC here. It's totally separated from this Ethernet port that you have from the iDRAC. Now moving on to the inside, this is kind of the iDRAC controller section. So this is kind of a section in itself. As I said earlier in the video, it's kind of a hardware in itself that kind of just sits right here, and in a way it's separated from all of the server itself, right? It has its own web interface. It has its own kind of, let's say, OS, so to speak. It's not really an OS, but it's a web interface. It has its own like kind of web interface OS that runs on its own even when the server is off. So when you connect it, when the server is completely off, as long as there's a power, that's important to remember. So when they say that the server is off, it still have to be power connected to it. If there's no power connected to it, I know it's kind of a trivial thing to say. Of course, you're not going to be able to access the iDRAC, but as long as there's a power cable connected to it, you should be able to get to this guy because it's separated from the rest of the system. So this is what I wanted you guys to see. You have your kind of component, your hardware, your iDRAC hardware component that's on the motherboard that allows you, that acts as a remote manager and allows you to control things, to turn things up, to run BIOS update, to run a whole bunch of updates that you want to run on your server without even having to really mess around with the server OS as a whole, or whatever you have, in my case, a Type 1 hypervisor on the server itself. So when you want to do BIOS update, when you want to do this update, when you want to do firmware update, you don't necessarily have to turn the server on and be like, hey, let me go in there and do this. No, you just go into your iDRAC and then you're able to upload all of those files and you're able to do whatever it is that you want to do. So that's pretty much what I wanted to show you guys, the hardware part of things. This is what it looks like, and this is where you connect it. Just keep in mind that it's a little bit different from this one, depending on the server that you have. It's a little bit different from this NIC that we have over here. I'm going to do one last zoom, and that's pretty much it. Now that we understand the hardware part of things, let's talk about IP. Let's talk about, because that's very important, let's talk about how we're going to get this online. Even before we turn it on, before we start setting up things in there, let's talk about how we're going to reach this, how we're going to get it online. Okay, guys, so now that we understand what an iDRAC is, we've taken a look at where an iDRAC is physically located on the motherboard. I want to talk IP address, right? So I'm going to go with an analogy here. Bear with me for a second. Hopefully this makes sense. So a DHCP or a DHCP server, or whatever it is that's giving out DHCP on your network. A DHCP basically is like the service on your network, right, that gives out IP address to everything on your network. So basically the way it works, bear with me, this analogy, hopefully it makes sense, is that you come to me, you come into my home, or you come into my network, and you say, hey, I'm looking for the person that's giving out IP address. I want to borrow an IP address. And the DHCP, I'm the DHCP server, and I say, hey, I'm the guy that gives out IP address. Do you want one? And then like, yeah, I want one. And then I say, here you go. Here's IP address. And then you look at it and you're like, oh, okay, I like this IP address. I want to keep it. And then you send me a message back and I'm like, oh, okay, you're going to keep it. Here's the time that you can keep this IP address for, right? Great analogy. Here's the time that you can keep this IP address for. When this time is over, I'm going to check back with you and say, hey, do you still want to keep this IP address? Or if you're not online, I'm going to be like, hey, since you're not online, I'm just going to take this IP address and then get it ready for somebody else that's going to come into my network. And I'm going to give it to them and say, here's an IP address. And the reason why I'm doing this analogy is because this is very important when it comes to your iDRAC. If your iDRAC is set up so that it automatically picks up an IP address, that IP address is always going to change either when the lease is over or when the device turned off for a while and you turn it back on, it's going to pick up a new IP address. Now, the problem with that is that that's going to cause you some headache because every time the IP address changes on your iDRAC, you cannot access the web interface. You have to go into your DHCP or go into other services to find out what the IP address is for your iDRAC. And that's not the way to set up your iDRAC. The way you want to set up your iDRAC is that you want to set it up a static IP address. A static IP address means that you tell whatever is giving out DHCP on your network to say, hey, this IP address, you can only assign it to this IP, to this device, right? That is called DHCP reservation. So it's where you reserve an IP address and say this IP address, no matter if the computer or the device turned off for like forever, do not assign it to anything else other than this device that has this MAC address. So that's one way to do it, to assign a static IP address, right? So you don't have to physically go into the iDRAC itself and then change the settings and change it to a static IP address, because in that case, you've already told whatever it is that's giving out DHCP on your network, whatever is giving out IP on your network, you've tell them that, hey, this IP address is always going to belong to this device. So if the device goes offline, the device do this, the device do that, it doesn't matter. Once that device comes on, it checks in for an IP address, your DHCP server or your DHCP service look at it and it says, oh, I know you, this is your MAC address, you get this IP address. So that's one way to set up an IP address for your iDRAC controller. You set DHCP reservation. The other way to do it as well is, again, whatever it is that's giving out DHCP on your server, on your network, you can set a range of IP address. So you can go from, say, hey, from 1 to 10, when you're setting up your DHCP service, you can say, hey, from 1 to 10, I do not want you to assign this IP address at all. So when you are giving out IP address, when you're listing out IP address, from 1 to 10, do not ever list out that IP address. And that block of number you can use whenever you want to set a static IP address to something. And then in this case, what you're going to do is you're going to go into your iDRAC, which is what we're going to do. And then you're going to set up your iDRAC as one of those static IP address. So what's going to happen is that since the static IP address is set on your iDRAC, when the device come back on, it's always going to be that IP address. And since that your DHCP service is not assigning that IP address inside of your scope, right? Your DHCP is always, that IP address is always going to be available for your DHCP to give it to your iDRAC device. I hope this makes sense. The moral of the story is that it's better to either do a DHCP reservation or to set a static IP address for your device, wherein you say, hey, your DHCP service, don't give out this range of IP address, and then set one of those IP address on your iDRAC controller. So now that we understand that part is very crucial, because we don't want the IP address to change all the time, because if it does, then it's going to be a headache. Let's go ahead and initiate the setup. Let's take a look at how we're going to set a static IP address, and let's dive into it and see what we need to do to get our hands dirty. Okay guys, so let's go ahead and finally set up iDRAC. So all the things that we've talked about, we're going to see it apply here on this section of this video. So this is where we're going to boot up the server. Right now, as you can see, there's no signal because the server is not boot up. So in your case, you're probably physically in front of the server. You have your keyboard, you have your mouse, you have your monitor connected. In my case, I'm remoting to the server. I'm actually using iDRAC, but I don't want you to worry about that right now. Just pretend you're in front of the server and you're booting it up, and this is your first time, and we're going to go through the process of looking at iDRAC and looking at all this other stuff that you have to look at. So I'm going to go ahead and boot it up, and we're going to go through the whole process together, okay? Again, you're in front of your computer right now. You have your keyboard and your mouse, and you have everything in front of you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pull up the keyboard here. All right, and then what we're going to do, I'm going to drag this down so you guys can see what's going on, and I'm going to turn on the server. So let me go ahead and boot up the server here, and then we're going to go from there. So the server is booting up now. If you can hear it in the background, it's already making its beautiful sound when it boots up. So it's configuring memory. So what we're going to do, if you have a keyboard and mouse in front of you, you're going to pretend this is your keyboard, and you're going to do what I'm doing. So you're going to press F12, F11, F2. In this case, I think it's F2 for the server. And there's two ways we can get to those two, and I'll talk about it. But let's give it a couple of minutes, let it do its thing. And we're going to go through the whole setup, you know, the stuff that we talked about, DHCP assignment, you know, DHCP reservation and all that stuff. I'm going to explain this concept here a lot better so it's easier to understand. All right. So you can hear it initializing iDRAC. You can hear it in the background. A couple of minutes, you're going to see something up here that says, hey, you can press F2 or F11. There you go. So we want F2, and you can also press F10 as well to get into the lifecycle controller. In there, you'll be able to configure iDRAC as well. But for now, we're going to go raw and dirty. We're just going to go right into it and be able to just get into the BIOS and make some changes in the changes that we want to make. And I'm going to explain to you all of the things that we talked about in the previous section of this video. So it's doing its thing, it's loading. All right. So remember, when it came up, you press F2, right? Don't forget that when it was loading, it would press F2. Again, you can also press F10 to get into the lifecycle controller and be able to change things around as well. F2 get into the BIOS setup, which is where we want to get to. All right, prepare to enter system setup. All right. Okay, so now we're in system setup. We don't necessarily need this keyboard and mouse anymore. I'm just going to use the up and down arrow. And if you have your keyboard in front of you, that's what you're going to use. I'm going to go ahead and go full screen here so it makes it easier for you guys to see. So you're basically going to use your up and down arrow to navigate, escape to go back. Now, it might be tricky because if I'm full screen and I press escape, it's probably going to go take the whole thing off of full screen, but we'll see. So what we want to do, the obvious part here, we want to go into iDRAC settings. We want to click on that. And in here, you can see that you can set a whole bunch of stuff. You can change a whole bunch of things that you want. You can change stuff for the lifecycle controller if you want to. A whole bunch of settings that you want to change, you can change it in here for iDRAC. But the first thing that I'm going to talk about is all the way down here. So this little guy right here, if you're looking at it, this guy right here, it says reset iDRAC configuration to default. Now, this is very important to do because if you get your iDRAC and your iDRAC is already configured, you want to reset it to default, so it reset to the default password. It changed a whole bunch of things that were already put in place. So if somebody already have a static IP in there, you want to change that because it can be a headache if somebody already have a static IP in there and you just don't know how to set it up, or you don't know how to go in there and change it, which I'm going to show you guys here, by the way. And you don't just want to deal with that. So what you want to do, reset to iDRAC, reset iDRAC configuration to default. It's going to reset it to default. It's going to go back to the way it was when it came out of the factory, when the server came out of the factory. And it's probably going to be set to DHCP. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you want to make that change. I highly recommend it. Also reset the password as well, so you can go back to the default password, the iDRAC default password, which you can look up online and then be able to log in. So what you want to do now that we've understand that, the next place we want to go to is network. Again, if you want to play around with any of the settings, you're welcome to do so. Just be careful, make sure you're aware of what you're changing before you change it, read up on it, understand it before you change it. What we're looking for is network settings. So we want to go into network settings. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple of things in here, and these are kind of reflective of some of the things that we talked about earlier in this video, like the IP part. This is mostly going to reflect the IP part of this video that we talked about. So a lot of it is going to make sense here. A lot of the things that we talk about is going to make sense here when we're physically in front of it and I'm explaining it to you guys. So the first thing that we notice is that the NIC is enabled. This is kind of the NIC on the iDRAC itself. We're going to notice that it's enabled, right? And then one of the things that we want to keep in mind before I get into the IP part of things is this part right here. So this, let me just go down there to blue. This guy right here, right? This is the MAC address. This MAC address. This is the MAC address for this iDRAC device. This is very important because this is what I was talking about when I say if you want to do a DHCP reservation, you need the MAC address of this device, and this is the guy that you need. So then you can go into whatever is giving out DHCP on your server, and then you can say, hey, this MAC address, always get this IP address, and you reserve that IP address for this MAC address. So if you want to do that, which I think it's ideal as well because it keeps things organized. You can go into your DHCP and you'll be able to see all of your stuff that have a DHCP reservation, and then you can say, oh, okay, this is what the IP address is, in case you forget the IP address, right? You'll be able to see it. It's a lot more organized, it's a lot more cleaner, and it makes life easier as well too. You go into your DHCP service, you go into whatever is giving out DHCP, and as long as you label it, then you'll be able to look at it and be like, hey, oh, okay, so this is the MAC address for the server, and for the iDRAC controller, and this IP address is what is assigned to it. And keep in mind that this MAC address is different from the server's MAC address itself because this belongs to the iDRAC server, and this is how you assign the static IP address to this iDRAC controller itself. Okay, so that takes care of the first part that we talk about when we say DHCP reservation. So you will need this to do the reservation because that's how you tell your DHCP to always assign specific IP address to this MAC address. So moving down, again, all of the settings you can play around with, but I want to kind of go to the main part for you guys so I don't beat around the bush. So if we go down a little bit more, you are going to see what we're looking for here. This is where the magic happens. All right, so remember when I tell you that you can either say, hey, well, first of all, we have IPv6 enabled, IPv4 enabled, sorry, not IPv6, IPv4 enabled, right? Enable DHCP. You notice that I have DHCP disabled. So this is what I was talking about. So if DHCP is enabled here, you can click on it and you're going to get this little box. If DHCP is enabled here, what's going to happen is that every time you turn off the server for a while and the server turns back on, the server is going to pick up a new IP address, and that's what we don't want, right? When you initially turn on your server, you reset it to factory configuration, it's most likely going to be able to pick up IP address from your DHCP service or whatever is giving that DHCP on your network. So we want to turn that off, right? We want to make sure it's disabled. And as we come down here, in my case, you notice that my IP address for my iDRAC is 192.168.2.25. Now, granted that you can see this IP address here. Now, let me be clear. I just wanted to kind of, because this is very important for you guys to understand. If we go back up here for a second, let's go back up, right? If I set this in whatever is given at DHCP on my server and I say, hey, this MAC address always get this IP address, right? Then I don't have to worry about all this configuration on the server itself in here. I don't even have to touch it anymore. So if I set this in my DHCP service and say this MAC address always get one specific IP address, then you can leave this down here to DHCP. Because it doesn't matter if it's DHCP when your iDRAC controller requests IP address from whatever it is that's given at DHCP on your network, that service is going to look at it and be like, oh yeah, I have you on my list as someone that has a reservation, and it's always going to get that IP address. So if you set a reservation, then you don't have to worry about turning this off. You can leave that on. You can leave that enabled and then just walk away. That's it. You don't even have to come in here. So if you have a reservation, just remember that. I just wanted to kind of make that clear. You don't have to come in here because your DHCP service is going to be doing all the work for you. It's going to assign all of your IP address for you. It's going to look at it and be like, oh, your MAC address. Oh, there you go. You have this. This is what we have reserved for you all the time, always. And you don't have to come in here. But if you don't, which in my case that I don't, then you have to come in here and then disable DHCP and then come down here and then click on that and then set a static IP address. This is the other way that I was talking about, and this is the way that I'm used to doing it. I like doing it a little bit. It's not ideal. I mean, I think it's better to have a DHCP reservation because then you can keep track of things, but I keep track of things anyways. When in my network, from one is your default gateway, but from 2 to 30 is not assigned. So that means that that's out of my DHCP scope. My DHCP service does not assign anything outside of anything from 2 to 30 to any device, right? It doesn't assign it unless I have that device set to static, which in this case is the iDRAC controller. So I have 25. So what I did, I was like, okay, well, I want to use 192.168.2.25. That's outside of my DHCP scope. So that means that my DHCP is never going to assign that IP address to anything on the device, but there's anything on my network, but this device. And this device is always going to have this IP address. I like doing that because it just gives me a range, and it allows me to play around with a little bit of more range and be able to say, oh, it has to be one of this IP address, 1 to 30. Play around with it. I don't have to go into a service to find out what the IP address is. So that's the way that I do it. So that's the other way that we talked about. And of course, you're going to need, so we can get out of that, you're going to need your you got out, of course. You're going to need the full screen. Let me go back full screen. You're going to need your default gateway. The default gateway is always the first IP address on your network, not unless you change it. You can change it, but it's always the first IP address on your network. So 192.168. And you're going to need your subnet. If you don't know these two things, what you can do, whatever device you have on your network, you can just go in there and then click IP. You can just go in there into command line and type in ipconfig or ipconfig/all. Be able to give you all of this information in terms of like your default gateway or your subnet, your static subnet mask or your subnet mask. If you set up your network, you should be already familiar with these two things. So as far as configuring your iDRAC and all of the things that we talked about, this is how you do it, right? This is how you set up the iDRAC. This is how you set up the IP address. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, you have to remember this IP address because this is how we're going to access the web interface. So make sure you remember this IP address. And now we're going to go to the next step where we're going to access the web interface. Okay guys, so now that we've set up our iDRAC, we've done everything that we need to do. The next thing that we need to do is navigate to the IP address, the static IP, or whatever it is that you do that we set up for iDRAC controller. And the way you want to do that is you want to go to whatever browser that you use in Chrome, Internet Explorer, or in my case Safari. So just keep in mind that depending on the browser that you're using, they might ask you to download some stuff, or they might ask you to do some things. I'm using Safari, so it doesn't ask me to do anything. And you want to type that IP address. Whatever it is that you set up for your static IP address, you want to type that IP address in here, because remember mine was 192.168.2.25, and all you have to do is click enter. Once you do, and it's going to take you to this little guy right here. So this is the web interface. This is the GUI interface for the iDRAC controller. This is where the extra magic happened, right? So if you set up everything right and you got everything the way it's supposed to set up, you should see this little guy right here that looks like this. Now for the username and password, you have to check the default username and password. You can look this up in Google, you can look this up anywhere and say what is the default password for iDRAC, and it should be able to give it to you. Once you get in there, of course, then you can change that and make changes to it and change whatever it is that you want to do. So once you do that, all you have to do is click submit. Initially, when you set this up, I've already set this up, it's going to go through a process. It's going to ask you to change the password. It's going to ask you to do a whole bunch of other stuff. That's fine. Just go through it. And then once you're done, you're going to log in. And when you come back to the screen, it's going to look like this. And in my case, I'm just going to click submit, and it's going to log me in. So once you click submit, it's going to take some time to verify some things. And then once it does, and then voila, we are in iDRAC. Now, this is iDRAC. This is where all of the beautiful extra magic happen. This is where you can control your server remotely, be able to launch a little secret secret here, like the whole process that we just went through when you set up the iDRAC controller in the first place, the DHCP. I did it through iDRAC, but that just comes to show you the power of it. So you can do a whole bunch of stuff here. You can change stuff, you can get information about your server, you can get logs, you can turn the server off or on, you can turn on the LED light. So for those of you guys that work in a data center, you know what this is. You can turn it on so it's that blinking, so you know where it is. You can make a whole bunch of settings in here. So if you have to update something, if you have to like update your drivers, you can do it in here. You can see some of the jobs that are in queues. You can see I did a BIOS update. So you can do a whole bunch of stuff in here that you want to do, or anything that you want to update on the server without having to physically go into the server itself. You can go to log. It gives you all of the log information about your server. You go to power terminal, it gives you a little bit of power information. I mean, power usage, your power usage on the server, and a whole bunch of stuff as well. And it gives you sub information that you want to know about power. So it's a very powerful tool. It gives you a whole bunch of information that you need. You can go to virtual console, and it gives you all the information about your virtual console. You go to alerts. If you want to set alerts for things, you can set them here. Setup, you can go into normal boot, and anything that you want to set up in here, you should be able to set it up. So it gives you all of this option that you can put into troubleshooting, license, gives you a license for your server, Trojan. It gives you a whole bunch of information that you need. This is telling me that the chassis is closed, which is, kind of know that. iDRAC settings, this is where you will come in and change your iDRAC. If you want to change your iDRAC setting and you don't want to do it in a BIOS setup, this is where you will come in and then make all that changes in here. So if you want to change the IP address, if you want to change current stuff or different from what you already have in here, you can come in here and make that change in here. Hardware, it gives you information about your hardware, your batteries, your fans, your CPU. If I was to click on that, it would give me a little bit of information about my CPU. It tells me what CPU I have, what core, what are the core count on the CPU. I mean, so much information. It gives you so much information. If I go to fan, it tells me all of my fans are working correctly. They're working the way they're supposed to work. If I go to memory, it tells me all of my memories are working the way they're supposed to work, and it tells me how much memory I have. Power supply, it tells me my power supply are doing okay. And this is where, if you're doing server maintenance, this is some of the things that you can come into and just click, hey, hardware, and then just check on it and then make sure your stuff is failing. It's funny because recently at my job, one of the drive in the RAID controller was failing, and going into something like this will allow you to be able to see it and say, hey, what's going on with my storage, what's going on with this, and it tells you that, hey, yeah, that's failing, you need to change it, that kind of thing. And of course, storage gives you a breakdown of your storage. It gives you all of your storage, your physical disk, and it tells you more about them. It gives you a virtual disk. You click on that, it gives you all your storage, and it tells you if one of them is failing. It gives you a little bit more information when you click on the drop down. So if you have something like Dell support or some sort of support system warranty, they normally ask for information like this. So this is where you come in and get the information that they request to troubleshoot it. So as far as the iDRAC go, guys, that's pretty much it. We've talked about it from the beginning. We've talked about what the iDRAC is. We've talked about how to make sure you set up things correctly. We'll look at the physical device on the machine itself, on the server motherboard itself. We've gone into detail about how to set it up, and we've kind of gone through the whole iDRAC setting itself. So that's pretty much all I got for you guys today. I'm going to try to make more videos like this. Awesome videos are coming. I have a lot of idea for the channel. So that's pretty much all I got for today. So I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching the video, guys. If this video helped you out in some way, make sure you hit that thumbs up button and help support the video so more people can see it. If you do like content like this, I try my very best to come out with one video every single week. So make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notification below so you can be notified every time I come out with awesome content like this. This channel is all about learning. It's about growing. It's about failing. So if you fall into that category and you want to learn, you want to grow with me, you want to fail with me and figure out things, hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications so you don't miss a thing. If you do want to see other of my cool videos that I've put out, you can check out my playlist. It's probably somewhere here, or you can head over to my channel. Again, thank you guys for watching. I will see you guys next week. As always, do not forget to stay geeking. Peace.